Thank you, Rico. Thank you very much. I know I see some old friends and acquaintances in the room. It's been a while, though, since I've had a chance to do a presentation in the Puget Sound area, to tell you the truth. Last night I was flying back from Philadelphia and reading a book, which is one of the books that I am into at this current time. I'd recommend it. It's called Infinite Progress. It's kind of an antidote to the rest of what's going on in the world. It's written by Byron Reese. Byron started a small information company, sold it to a company called Demand Media. Demand Media does ehow.com, I suppose, which might be seen in some ways as a competitor to the library. And they also do, interestingly enough, the Livestrong Foundation website and a half a dozen other information-oriented websites. And in this, and Byron himself is a historian. And as I kind of skipped around in the book on the plane last night, I came to a story which I thought was just so perfect for this morning. And yet you'll see why when I tell you what it is. I wonder how much we really understand the difference that reading made to human civilization. And that it actually has not been around for all of that long. I mean, we know that the species has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, by some estimations, millions of years. We know that what we think of as civilization has been around for 11, 12,000 years. But reading, at least reading by virtually everybody, anybody who's literate, is a pretty recent invention, as we all know. So toward the end of the book, actually, Byron tells this story. In the late 300s, so not very long ago, a Christian bishop by the name of Augustine of Hippo wrote an autobiography. And from that autobiography, we learn a lot about what life was like at that time in the year 300 or so, and in particular, the act of reading, interestingly enough. He describes a day when he sees his mentor, whose name is Ambrose, looking intently at an open book. Now, this was before the printing press, so this would have had to have been a handwritten book, of course. And after staring for 2 to 3 minutes at the book, Augustine noticed that Ambrose turns the page and then continues to stare at the book. And this surprises Augustine, because he can't quite figure out what Ambrose is doing. Augustine finally asked, "What are you doing?" Ambrose replied that he was reading. Augustine said that could not be the case, because Ambrose he couldn't hear anything, and he could see that Ambrose's lips were not moving. And I didn't know this, but at that time when reading was new, reading was pretty much done aloud, because people assumed if you didn't read it aloud, you wouldn't be able to grasp what was there in the words. The idea of staring at words on paper and have the ideas kind of magically go through your eyeballs and write themselves on your brain made no sense. It was very creepy to people at that time. And so they either read aloud, or certainly they read silently to themselves with their lips moving. And according to Byron Reese, as a matter of fact, and those of you who really know the history of libraries, as I do not, may or may not confirm that this is true, that the original reading rooms, for example, the reading rooms at the Library of Alexandria, were created not like the reading rooms that we've all been in some library where it's deadly silent. But instead, the purpose of reading rooms was to set aside a space where people could go read the books aloud so that they could understand what was in the books. And so they had come from a completely oral tradition before reading and before writing, and had to and believed that that was the way that human beings, the only way that human beings could intake information. I found that just really interesting. When we think, and I'm often asked as a futurist, which is my profession now, don't you think that perhaps interacting on the internet or interacting with our cell phones and so on is kind of creepy? Isn't it kind of destroying our humanness, changing us too much, kind of diluting our intelligence, or making it impossible for us to actually communicate with other people? You have to remember what it was like those hundreds or more than 1,000 years ago, when people who had grown up in a village where the sum of all human knowledge was contained in the brains of the 300 or 400 people in the village, as far as they knew. And as people died, certain knowledge was lost, and only the knowledge that they could remember here made sense. And to them, that's what it meant to be human. So when somebody would have said to them, as I already said, imagine a day when you can just look at a page and the ideas will magically go right through your eyeballs and land here and stay there. They would have thought, that's not being human, that's inhuman. That's just not how life works. So as we anticipate not just today's technologies, but tomorrow's technologies, it's kind of helpful to keep that in mind. Well, I thought that was just such a really good story that I couldn't resist it. Let me tell you what I'm going to do this morning with you. Two things, I think. Number one, I'm going to inspire you with some possibilities. I believe the title of our program was Risks and Opportunities. And number two, I intend to do this quite deliberately, scare the crap out of you on a couple of different things, because I think we're underestimating, and I don't usually do this. This is kind of new for me. I'm not known as the futurist who gets up and gives a sort of gloomy speech and says, repent, or the world will be lost. But I do intend to do that. And so I expect, let me ask a question. I'm going to ask actually quite a few audience participation questions as I go along this morning. How many of you in the room are kind of naturally optimistic about the future? Well, you're going to enjoy my speech, okay? And how many of you are kind of tend more to be kind of pessimistic about the future? You're going to enjoy my speech too, okay? You're going to say, that guy's right on. He really knows what he's talking about. Okay, so let's see if we can go to the first slide. The first thing I'm going to do is to ask you a couple of questions, just to get you thinking about the future and for me to see what you're thinking. Here's the first question. Let's look to the year 2025. So that's not very far from now. It sounds kind of futuristic, but it's really only 12 years from now. On a scale from 1 to 10, how different will the future be in 2025 compared to today? It's kind of like asking how different is today compared to the year 2000. In some ways, things are really different than it was in 2000 when you really stop to think about some of the global and technological events and so on that have happened since January 1st, 2000. So we're kind of talking about that time span. And what I'm going to do is to count from 1 to 10. And I want you to raise your hand when I hit your number, all right? So 1 will be, I don't think life will be very much different at all in the year 2025. It will look almost exactly like today. Nothing stays exactly the same, but there won't be any really dramatic change. And 10 is, the world would be so different from today that it would be almost unrecognizable to us. All right? So I'm going to count, and then you just raise your hand when I hit your number. What we actually get is sort of the bell curve in action. So are you ready? So when I hit your number, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, that was an interesting smatter. Mostly 6, 7s, 8s kind of in there. I personally am at probably about a 6. I don't think will be completely unrecognizable by any means. I think there will be some dramatic changes. There is a possibility that some really important things could happen that we don't even know what they are right now. Let me ask for a different year though. Let's go out to the year. I know we're supposed to be looking at the short-term future, gentlemen, so I apologize for this, but let's go out to the year 2062. Okay? The year 2062, beyond the lifetime of some of us in this room. But within the lifetime of my kids, for sure, if they're fortunate, and within the lifetime, I'm sure, of your children or grandchildren or young people that you know of. So 2062, let's do the same count. I'll do it very fast. So 1, it won't look much different in 2062 than it does today, and 10, it'll look so different that we would hardly recognize it today. So ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. See, that's interesting because one of the other things that Byron Reese does, of course, in this book, which is not a big surprise, him being a historian, is to point out that you don't have to go very far back in history and nobody would have raised their hand 9 or 10. Life didn't change very fast. So if you're in some ancient civilization for sure, but even kind of an older civilization or society compared to ours, most of us would have said, no, it won't really be that different. It might be 2 or 3, but it won't be 10 in 50 years. Just remember that year, though, 2062, because it'll come back to you in just a little bit. So that's the first question. The second question is, how many of you, so raise your hand. You can see you have 3 choices. How many of you read science fiction? How many of you don't read science fiction? And how many of you don't know whether you read science fiction? And most of us probably all ought to raise our hands for C, because there's all kinds of stuff that we read about today and about tomorrow. We really don't know whether it's science fiction or not. Even those writing it probably don't really know whether what they're saying is true. But I do recommend, by the way, that you read, if you're interested in sort of planning and anticipating the future, and particularly if that's part of your job, I would encourage you to pick up at least 1 science fiction book a year. Because the best science fiction writers, in my experience, are the best at imagining alternative futures. Better than the average futurist and better than the average strategic planner. Because they really tend to know their science really well. And they say, well, if these are the current scientific developments, then it's not really all that far-fetched for that the world will look like the following at some either near or distant point in the future. And they really tease out sort of alternative possibilities for us better than most. But that question is really just for fun. Because what I really want to ask you is, what is your image of the future? When you think of the future, what kinds of pictures pop into your mind? What kinds of words or phrases? Conveniently, we're sitting at round tables. Some of you have a lot at the table, some of you don't have so many, because I only want to give you 60 seconds. So if you've got more than 6 people, you'll have like 10 seconds each. So it's not very much time. But I want you to, and not everybody has to chime in, I want you to answer the question, when you think of the future, and we could be thinking 5 years, 15 years, 50 years, doesn't really matter. When you think the future, what kind of word or picture pops into your head? And if the only thing that pops into your head is just blank, there's more coffee right over there. So you got 60 seconds. I'm going to time. You got 60 seconds at your table. So go. Okay, let's call time. So if you will, if you're willing, let me get, if somebody at a table will raise your hand, and if you want to say, well, Judy had a really good image, or you want to say, here's an image of the future. I'd like to get half a dozen to a dozen different examples out. So who has an image of the future that you think was interesting, or heard one that was interesting? Yes?
Well, several people at our table thought of the Jetsons. We talked about the Jetsons this morning.
Did you really? Okay, that's an interesting one. Okay. And what else? Yes?
Simplicity. We want one device.
Simplicity, one device, yes. People are trying to figure that out as we speak. What else? Hovercraft and rocket ships. Yes. Yeah.
Just we would range from more pavement to more microprocessors.
More pavement to more microprocessors, yeah. Yep. This one here, and then I'll come to the back, okay?
I think we were thinking less pavement. All of our answers kind of came together with less pollution, really powerful localized power sources, maglev transportation, and spending our time in very different ways.
Okay, excellent. And in the very back?
Global unity and hopefulness.
Local unity and...
Global unity.
Global unity. Oh, global unity, okay. Okay, that's interesting. Yes?
Robots providing senior care services.
Robots providing senior care services. Okay, excellent. I should have said, by the way, that the subtitle of Byron's book is How the Internet and Technology, listen carefully, How the Internet and Technology Will End Ignorance, Disease, Poverty, Hunger, and War. He starts off by saying, I was a history student, including a graduate student in history, and so I know that that's a very big claim. But he says, I think it's coming, and I think it's coming within the lifetime of my children, is what he says. And so it's a good literary critic could probably tear it apart sentence by sentence, but it's intriguing. So what is your image of the future? There is a follow-up question, by the way, which is, why is that an important question? And it's an important question because our images tend to exert an influence over the choices that we make. Some years ago, actually it was in the 1990s, I remember being at a Seattle conference on economic development and so on, and Craig McCaw, remember Craig McCaw, the Cellular One guy at the time, and then Nextel and so on. He got up and he was talking about transportation and telecommuting and all of this, and he said, in the future, we will travel to get together, but not to do most basic work. Transportation planners are constantly getting together and asking how many people are going to be driving and how many people are going to be turning left at this intersection in the year 2020 and so on and so on. And we're always trying to figure out what infrastructure we're going to need. He was saying something radically different. If you change your image of how things could work, you would do something different. And that is true in every organization, in every region. If you want to change what the region is doing or what your organization is doing, change the future. Change the future and the present will follow. Now there's no American piece of literature that I know that had a bigger impact on our images of the future than the Jetsons. Which is really quite fascinating. When we, in our mind's eye, imagine what the 21st century is supposed to look like, it's pretty much like what the Jetsons claimed it was going to look like, right? And so we think, well, where are those flying cars? And why don't we have more moving sidewalks? And when will the robots really be capable of taking care of the elderly and not just vacuuming the carpet? And so on and so forth. And when will we be living in space? And most of us in the room probably don't know that this is the 50th anniversary of the debut of the Jetsons cartoon show. It debuted in the fall of 1962. And most of us also don't know, given how powerful it's been at shaping our images of what life is supposed to be like in the 21st century, is that it lasted for one television season. It was on the air for 27 episodes or 26, I guess 26 episodes, 62, 63. Then it was canceled. There was a revival of it in the mid-70s, and so some more episodes were created, and that's probably why we get confused about it. But it had such an impact for 26 cartoon episodes. How did it do that? It's really quite amazing. What is also not understood is that the creators of the Jetsons were not imagining our time right now. We think, we got here and we say, well, so the Jetsons were wrong. We don't have any flying cars. Well, they actually were imagining the year 2062. This was their vision of 100 years from now. And so maybe, since all of us raises our hands at 9 and 10, maybe they won't be so far wrong when we get to 2062. So the first question and the big question for the future always is, what is your image of the future? To unpack that, it's helpful to take a look at some domains of or some future trend areas in which things are happening and will continue to happen and therefore shape what the future actually is. And I'm going to, with you today, look at demographic dynamics, at technology acceleration, at economic inequality, which would be my take on the economy, at sustainable opportunities, and then finally I want to talk a little bit about choices that we have. So let's start with, I'm trying to see if I can keep it coordinated here. Let's start with demographics. What's the most powerful demographic trend shaping, let's say, the United States or this region right now? Well, you have three to choose from. The emergence of a new youth population, the increasing diversity in the population, and the aging of the population, all three of which are important. And it actually is kind of hard to figure out which one is the most important in terms of what our future is going to look like, in my opinion. But I'm going to start with the one that I find actually kind of hopeful and interesting, although they all have their own versions of hope and interest. And that is the emergence of this new generation. How many of you have kids or grandkids? Oh, well, let me ask it this way. We got a few younger people in the room. How many of you were born in the room between 1980 and the year 2000? Okay. And then how many of you, okay, you can put your hands down, how many of you have kids or grandkids who were born between 1980 and the year 2000? So in our family we have three, although the oldest was born in 79, so she's right on the cusp. That is the generation which followed Generation X, which followed the baby boom generation, and which became most popularly known as the Millennial Generation. Some say 1984 to 2004, others say 1980 to 2000, but roughly the 80s and the 90s, okay? What's different about that group of young people who are on the leading edge, not all that young anymore, to tell you the truth, because they're in their 30s now on the leading edge? Number one, it was a bigger group than the baby boom. It was a smaller percentage of the overall US population, so it has not had quite the cultural impact yet. But it was a very big group. And it's kind of moved through our schools, and now it's moving into the workforce, and in fact is already moving into positions of authority in some organizations because the leading edge of them are in their early 30s already. But that, of course, is not what makes them unique. What really makes them unique is that they are the first digital native population. So in the room we have a half dozen digital natives, and all the rest of us in the room are digital immigrants. Okay? And that's not a term that's new in any way. Mark Prensky coined it some years ago as a way of talking about. I used to call them the .com generation, but digital native kind of caught on and has become the kind of term of art for this group. Why are they digital natives? Well, the answer is obvious. They're born starting in the early 1980s. They're born since the personal computer revolution, since the IBM PC, since Apple computers and so on. Yeah, there were Radio Shack computers, and there were the early Apple computers in the 70s, but the PC revolution didn't really start until the 1980s. And then if they're in the younger half of this group, born since the 1990s, they're the first internet generation, right? And so they've grown up since they were little kids, not starting when they were 30 years old or 40 years old or 50 years old, working a smartphone. They were doing this when they were 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old. And so these are the kids who you see walk up on YouTube or perhaps even in your own home to the big screen TV, and they start going like this, and then they get pretty frustrated because it's not acting like an iPad. Although, in some homes they're beginning to act like an iPad, and before long they will all act like an iPad and respond to our gestures. That's a digital native who just assumes that's how technology works. There's some research suggestions that it actually changes their brain wiring to grow up using technology in this way. But it certainly has ratcheted up the integration of this kind of technology into all of life. One of the interesting things that I think is quite clearly true is for the digital native generation, there is much less separation between what we think of, those of us who are digital immigrants, the online world and the offline world. So we are still, we oldsters are still fond of saying things like, well, can you stop for just a second while I go online? Whereas for a digital native, there really is much less separation. So much so that I think that as the tools get more and more continuously online, more and more always with us, perhaps wearable, certainly increasingly carryable and therefore always with us, perhaps even implantable in some cases. By 2025 or so, the concept of online and offline will have sort of disappeared. There will only be sort of this integrated life in which we are constantly immersed in the real world, that is the physical world, and which we are also constantly immersed in the digital world, and we will experience them simultaneously, and we won't really sense that big a separation between them. That's a little hard to grasp. It's sort of like words going magically through your eyeballs into your brain, I think. That's kind of what it's like. So for fun, though it will take a little bit of time, if you don't really yet grasp the difference between we digital immigrants and digital natives, I have a short video. Some of you might have seen this. It kind of flew around YouTube at one point. But it's a nice illustration of some digital immigrants grasping their new technology. Let's see if we can get it to work here. There are subtitles, so if the sound isn't too loud, don't worry about it because it's not in English. That's cute. So here's the bottom line with digital natives, and really all of us going forward. Children of the screen don't accept old limitations. They don't accept old limitations in how they interact with your institutions, whatever they might be. They don't accept old limitations how they interact with information and how they produce information, et cetera. You can just kind of make every list of practically every human activity that you can think of, and children of the screen approach it differently and expect us to approach it differently and get frustrated when we're not approaching it differently fast enough. When we imagine the future use of technology, whether it's in and through libraries or any of our institutions, it's helpful, I think, to stop thinking of we ourselves, those of us who are digital immigrants, and start trying to see it through the eyes of digital natives and imagine when they're running the libraries, when they're running the schools, when they're running my business, and so on, and when all of a new employee workforce and most of my customers are digital natives going forward, we'll take a leap with technology kind of beyond what we've been doing now. So we've been playing around and experimenting up till now, but we're getting ready for a much bigger leap. So that's the digital native population. The second thing that's happening in demographics, of course, is the increasing diversity of the US population, which, of course, is very, very dramatic. It's somewhat less dramatic in the counties that we're talking about here, but this is an interesting set of statistics that came from a study by the Pew Foundation, which was done right after the last presidential election, because they became immediately curious about why was it that the Latino vote had such a big impact on the presidential election, and what might be the future prospects of the Latino vote. And what they discovered was, this was published at the beginning of December, the median age of native-born Latinos in the US is 18. The median age of all Latinos in the US is 27 compared to 42 for non-Hispanic whites in the US. 67,000 US Latinos turn 18 each month, and 93% of them are citizens. 40% of all US population growth from now to 2030 will be Hispanic. And 77% of all population growth from now to 2030 will be among groups that we have traditionally labeled as minorities, i.e. leaving only 23% of the population growth coming from non-Hispanic whites in the population, i.e. we are rapidly moving toward a much more diverse population. The Census Bureau says 2040. Some people now argue that it could come a little bit sooner when the majority of the US population becomes the collection of groups that we have formerly labeled as minorities. Now, it's a little less true in Snohomish County and Island County. You know, the population, while there's been some significant growth among the Latino population in particular in Snohomish County, the percentages are really still quite small compared to other parts in the state and other parts of the country. But even here, we are becoming more diverse. And one of the things that this means is I travel around the country, and then I sit in with, let's say, in boardrooms or among senior executive leadership teams and so on, and I look around the room and I just simply ask the question, when do you think this room will begin to reflect that population reality? because very few of them have reflected at all yet. But it's really hard to imagine that they won't in the relatively near future. There will be a time lag, I'm sure, but it's time to really to think about that a little bit more seriously. In addition to which, there are some issues with recent, in particular, Latino immigrant populations in terms of accessing certain services and certain benefits that we have here in the country. But that's an interesting one. And some would argue that the increasing diversity of the US population is probably the #1 demographic trend. But I tend, it's probably because of my own age, and so I tend to over-exaggerate my own importance. But I tend to think that the aging population is, for the next few years, will be the #1 issue in terms of demographics. Let me ask you this question. What is the percent of people over 65 in Sno-Isle counties in 2025? And I will have you raise your hand. So how many of you think that 12% in 2025 of the population of these two counties will be over the age of 65? How many think it will be 20%? And how many think it will be 25%? Well, 2 of you are right. It's either B or C. It depends a little bit on the county. Island County already is 19% over the age of 65. And it doesn't take much of a mathematical calculation to imagine then 25, perhaps even as much as 30% of the population in Island County will be over the age of 65. And in Snohomish County, which of course is younger given the housing and the demographics and the jobs and everything in this county, it's around 12% today. But we are forecast to be closer to 20% by 2025. The US Census Bureau says we will have 27 Floridas, or they could have said 27 island counties as states in 2025. So we are moving from, in most cities and towns, if you walk down the streets, a world in which 1 out of every 10 people you see is over the age of 65, to a world, as you walk down the very same streets in the very same city or town, 1 out of every 5, and in some places 1 out of every 4 people that you see is over the age of 65. This is a discontinuous change. This has never before existed in the whole history of human civilization so far as we know. Nobody knows how we should organize a society when 1/4 of the population is over the age of 65 because nobody's done it before. You can argue that Japan is a little bit ahead of us, it's true, and you can argue that Italy is a little bit ahead of us, that's true, and so on. There's some regions of the world which are a little ahead of us on the aging curve, but this aging curve is happening all over. And it's happening now dramatically in the US. Ken Deitwald wrote the very famous book called The Age Wave. When did he write that? He wrote it in 1990. And in 1990, Ken Deitwald said, about the year 2011, the first baby boomer will turn 65, and then for the next 20 years, we'll have this tidal surge. It's not a crashing wave, but a tidal surge that just goes on and on and on and on as people turn 65. Now, it turns out 65 is relatively young for most people. But soon they'll be 70, and then they'll be 75, and then they'll be 80 and 85, and then we're in the midst of the true age wave. So let's go to this question. What is the estimated 401k savings needed for a comfortable retirement for those with an average income of $30,000, which it turns out is the average income in these two counties, although in Island County it's about $1,000 higher per year. It's kind of hard to believe for some of us in the room who can hardly imagine living on $30,000, but some of us in the room might live on $30,000 right now, and that's the average per capita money income in these two counties. And if you talk to a financial planner, they'll say you should have a certain percentage, a certain multiple of that in savings in your 401k if you want to retire at a reasonably comfortable level compared to your annual income now. So what should it be if you're making $30,000 a year? How many of you think it should be you should save $25,000, $140,000, $250,000, $650,000? Well, you're wrong. The actual answer is you should save, the color show up, $250,000. It's a multiple of about 8. So they say. So if you're sitting here and you make $90,000 or $75,000 or $110,000 and you don't have a multiple of 8, the financial planners will say, well, you're a little short of what you need if you're going to live a comfortable retirement. So that's the number that we are supposed to have saved in our 401ks, which is the primary retirement tool for most people in the United States today. What is the actual number? Actual 401k savings of people approaching 65 in the United States. And I might have flashed on this because I was pushing the buttons when I shouldn't have been. How many think it's the actual savings is $25,000, $140,000, $250,000, $650,000. The actual amount in the average 401k account of a person approaching 65 in the United States is $25,000. What does that mean? What does that mean? Let's talk about aging in America. I've already given you the numbers. We're going to approach 20%, and then in some large parts of the country, 25% of the population over 65. And in our mind's eye, this is what the world is supposed to look like when we get into that age bracket and we join the ranks of those that we call the retired. Now, we do know, and it is true, that the third phase of life, formerly called retirement, is in the process of being reinvented. And some of you are probably already engaged in that. And I probably wrote my first article in 1995 or so called The End of Retirement. At the time, I was in my 40s, and it seemed really to make sense that the notion of retirement being defined as you will work and earn income up to a certain age. At that age, you will cease income-generating work and live the rest of your life with a lifestyle dominated by leisure and paid for by accumulated savings and benefits. That's classic American 20th century retirement. It didn't exist before the 20th century. We made it up in the 20th century. We created an industry to support it. And by the end of the 20th century, it was pretty much assumed that when you got to about 60, 62, 65, a few younger, that you would cease income generating work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that, as we see on the screen, this is what life was supposed to look like. At the time, about 60% of those employed in the US had a form of retirement called a pension, and about 40% did not. And then we had Social Security benefits, and then you had other forms of savings and home equity and so on to support it. So it worked for a majority of people. Given the numbers that we've just seen, is this what the next 20 years looks like or not? Or does the next 20 years look more like this? Which one is reality for the US? If you're paying attention, you see this becoming reality in your local Starbucks, at your local grocery checkout line, and so on. As you can clearly see people who probably did not expect to be working at that age back there trying to make ends meet. It's not because necessarily they think, oh, this will be fun, although some do, of course, and most of us imagine probably not completely stopping all gainful employment when we hit 65-ish. We imagine doing other things we've always dreamed of, and so on. But that is the reality that we're moving to. What does it really mean? We are on the cusp, according to Forbes magazine last week on the 20th of March, the greatest retirement crisis in American history. We are on the precipice of the greatest retirement crisis in the history of the world. In the decades to come, we'll witness millions of elderly Americans, the baby boomers and others, slipping into poverty. Too frail to work, too poor to retire, will become the new normal for many elderly Americans. That dire prediction, which I wrote 2 years ago, is already coming true. And I will read a couple more things out of here. Let's see if, no, I'll stick it on this one. If you are, well, let's see, the average 401k balance for 65-year-olds is estimated at $25,000 by independent experts. $100,000 if you believe the retirement planning industry. He got a lot of pushback to this article and came back in the same blog and the same article at Forbes and said, here's the source. It's a study that says the average person approaching 65 in the US has in their 401ks less than $30,000, despite what we hear from the financial planning industry. Even if you are among the lucky few that have a pension, you cannot rest assured that it will be there for all the years you'll need it. Whether you know it or not, someone is busy trying to figure out how to screw you out of your pension. Americans also know the great 401k experiment of the last 30 years has been a disaster. There's no other language to call it. It is now apparent that 401ks will not provide the retirement that was promised to workers. This person worked as a legal counsel to financial planning firms when the 401k was introduced. Most of us don't know that the 401k was introduced not as a primary retirement vehicle. It was introduced as a means by which large companies could provide additional remuneration to senior executives tax-free. And then the financial planning industry and the companies caught on that, well, maybe we could actually extend this to everybody and relieve the responsibility of pensions from ourselves and put it on the individual workers. And so the program transitioned in a fairly short period of time from a supplement for senior executives for tax-free income to the primary retirement savings system. As a matter of fact, not that long ago, I was with one of the leading companies in the world providing retirement assistance or pensions and annuities and so on to people. And they were in the process of transitioning all of their new employees from their guaranteed fixed benefit system to a 401k. And I thought, well, now this is really interesting. But when you read these numbers, this is the part where I said I would scare you. Because how are we going to deal with this in the next 20 years? So the system was created in that way. This guy remembers in the late 1980s a sales tool that the company for whom he was legal counsel going out and selling 401k policies, which, by the way, have made trillions of dollars for the financial planning industry, but have resulted in accounts of $30,000 or less for the average person approaching retirement. He remembers a cardboard wheel. Some of you are old enough to remember this kind of thing, a cardboard wheel. Remember what interest rates and stuff were like in the 1980s. And you would just spin the wheel to figure out which return you wanted to get on your 401k. So if you spun it here, it would land on government bonds. So you'll get 12% a year. And then you'd spin it here and you've got a mix of stocks and bonds. You can expect a return of 14% or 18% a year. And then you spin it here. Well, this is the most conservative investment you can possibly make. You can expect a return of 8% a year. Is anybody expecting those returns right now in the next few years? Is there anything in the policy positions of the country that suggests we're going to see 8 to 18% returns on our investments? It's true that if you're a really good stock buyer and you're really lucky, that might happen in certain cases. But the average person turns out not to be that good a stockbroker, a stock manager. It was a kind of looking back at it, it just doesn't make any sense. But that's what we did. And Forbes isn't the only one noticing. Let me skip ahead here to this slide. Here's the Wall Street Journal. Retiring boomers find 401k plans fall short. And then here's a column from the USA Today by one of my favorite economist writers, Duncan Black, which he wrote in February of this year. Recent and new retirees, the first major cohort of the 401k era, do not have nearly enough in retirement. And this is what he says. We need an across-the-board increase in Social Security. We need an across-the-board increase in Social Security retirement benefits of 20% or more. We need it to happen right now. Even if that means raising taxes on high incomes or removing the salary cap in Social Security taxes. What's the conversation, of course, that's going on in the national halls of government about Social Security? Precisely the opposite of the conversation that should be going on if they were paying attention, in my opinion, to what is really going on among the cohort which are approaching retirement and relying on 401ks. And oh, by the way, people at one point said, well, you don't have to worry about the 401ks. You're all going to have all that equity in your homes. If you're like me and you live in this area, you lost a couple $100,000, maybe more, of equity, which is really not that likely to come back to quite that level in time for retirement. So is it, is it accurate or inaccurate? Is it fiction or science fiction to say that we might be facing a retirement crisis of pretty monumental proportions over the next, it's more than the short-term future, it's over the next 25 years or so. Things could change, we could improve it, but it's a very, very big issue, which is just now, it's only in this year, 2013, that you begin to see these headlines in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, and so on. Nobody was talking about this until this year. But the good news is that we're finally waking up to it. So now let's turn from the worst of times to the best of times. And as a matter of fact, Byron Reese says it's the way out of the fix that we're in. In fact, he says the way out of the fix is inevitable. I don't know if I agree with that. I think it might be science fiction. But let's start with this one. I said demographics was the first thing. The second thing is accelerating technology. The amount of data in the world is doubling every, you got 4 choices. How frequently is the amount of data doubling in the world? The amount of data is doubling every 5 years, every 3 years, every 18 months, every 2 days. Let's see what the correct answer is. The amount of data in the world, according to Eric Schmidt of Google, is doubling every 2 days. Now, data does not necessarily equal information, which does not necessarily equal knowledge, which does not necessarily equal wisdom, but the amount of just ones and zeros is doubling every 2 days. We could just all go home, contemplate that for a week. What does that mean? It's pretty amazing. Let's see what comes next here. America ranks what rank among nations in the world in internet access? How many think we rank 3rd? Do we rank 9th? Do we rank 19th? Do we rank 27th? Correct answer as of a couple years ago, I don't actually know for sure exactly right now, was 19th. We might have gone up or down a ranking or two, but clearly there are parts of the world which have much better internet access than we do, much faster and much more widespread. And we are number 19 when we probably ought to be closer to 9 or even 3. The number of Americans, I put it there, the number of Americans who don't have access, who do not access online content. And actually I get this number from a recent summary of trends done by Ken here at the library. So I'm counting on Ken to have this one accurate, but this is right out of your list of stuff here. The number of Americans who do not access online content. Doesn't mean they couldn't, possibly, they just don't do it, okay? 35, 65, or 125 million. How many think 35 million do not access online content? Remember, we have over 300 million people in the country. 65 million, 125 million. Answer is 65 million don't access online content. This is also from this summary of trends here that Ken put together for the library. The proportion of haves who access Washington State libraries is 1 in 10, 5 in 10, or 8 in 10. So if you're sort of on the have side of the scale economically, how much do you access the library systems? 1 in 10 access it, 5 in 10, 8 in 10. The answer is 8 in 10, interestingly enough. The proportion of have-nots who access the Washington State libraries is 1 in 10, 5 in 10, 8 in 10. It's actually 1 in 10. This one is actually, to me, kind of the counterintuitive opposite of kind of what you'd expect. Is that those of us who also have access, easy access to online content on our own, tend to also use the libraries, whereas the opposite is true. And so that actually has some interesting implications for future library policy, outreach, development, and so on. So let's go on to the next one. So let's talk about technology acceleration. One of my just favorite things. What we know is that over the last few years, the development of technology has continued to accelerate, and in fact, it's been accelerating very fast. Eric Schmidt wrote that information about the doubling of data every 2 days, and he said, if you look at beginning in the year 2003, and he made this statement in 2010 that data was now doubling every 2 days compared to what it was like in 2003. What he says that means is if you take all the information ever created in the history of the world up till 2003, you've got twice as much of that 2 days later, and then twice as much of that 2 days after that, and so on. What changed in 2003? What really changed was the internet became not a place you went to read stuff or watch stuff, but a place you went to produce stuff. So after 2003 came YouTube, came Twitter, came Facebook, came blogging, and so on. And we suddenly discovered that everybody wants to say something. And that actually is a very important point. And that has led to the acceleration of technology in all of these different areas. Connectivity increasing, the convergence of technologies into more and more capable devices and more integrated devices until it is possible that you could carry around one device if you don't mind looking at a small screen, or get a phone that's 2 or 3 times the size that also acts as a pad, and you could theoretically get by with that single device if you want to. And almost all devices now are internet devices, and that's the convergence in the connectivity. And we're very, very close to almost all devices being capable of 3D or 3D simulated 3D kinds of communications, so that you hold your phone in a certain way and a 3D image pops up. Or you put on a set of Google Glasses and you can see a 3D image while you can also see the real world. And that's over the next 5 or 10 years, that will become more and more common until almost all of what we think of as communication over these devices will be in 3 dimensions if you want that. The other thing that's really actually quite interesting about these devices is almost nobody talks on them anymore. If you remember the days when you would go into restaurants and there would be big signs, put away your cell phones, no talking on the cell phones in our restaurant. I challenge you to go into a restaurant now and find anybody talking on a phone. You can find 75% of the people going like this on the phone, but almost nobody is saying anything. And almost these devices are used less and less and less to actually speak to people, and more to type words. And that is interesting. So let's take a look at the internet through the eyes of Byron Reese. When we say, well, most futurists didn't anticipate the internet because it was so different from anything that existed before. Although there was some thinking about what computer networks would do if they became available to everybody. When we say the internet is an electronic library, this is true. But it is an electronic library bigger and better than any other library that has ever existed or even been contemplated by humans. When we say the internet is an electronic store, this is true. But it is the biggest, best store ever, where you can buy anything from anywhere based on reviews by other buyers at a discount and have it gift wrapped, engraved, altered, drop shipped, and delivered by tomorrow. If the internet is an electronic debate, it is a more robust forum for debate than has ever before arisen on the planet, where you can find people expressing any viewpoint on any topic at any time of the day or night. If the internet is an electronic cocktail party, it is more like 100 million cocktail parties going on at once. What's more, the internet can be a fact checker, post office, Rolodex, Yellow Pages, White Pages, game board, garage sale, university, movie theater, jukebox, matchmaking service, travel agent, photo album, bank support group, and so on. The internet does not, like a car, have a single purpose. We don't even know what the internet is for yet, because in a certain sense it's for everything. And until I picked up this particular book, I think even I, as a futurist, was underestimating the internet. Let me see if I can get back to Eric Schmidt. This is what Eric Schmidt says starting there in 2003. The reason that it's doubling so fast, there are millions of blog posts every day, 100 million tweets a day, millions of comments and reviews, uncounted people writing questions and posting them on the internet, and uncounted millions of people immediately writing answers to those questions. 100 million photos are uploaded a day on Facebook alone, not to mention all the other websites. In addition to all of the videos and all of the music that is uploaded. It's really an amazing, amazing thing that's going on with the internet. And I think we're just, well, Eric Schmidt says basically the internet is just about finished being a baby and is ready to start moving into childhood. Think about that. As the machines themselves get smarter and smarter and smarter and more capable of not just kind of remembering things in ones and zeros, but capable of anticipating what we want to know and telling us what we want to know before we ask the question. That, according to the people who think about these things, is the next stage. Not just being really good at answering questions for us, but anticipating what we want to know before we actually know that we want to know it. And saying, I think you need to know this. You're flying into Philadelphia, here's 5 things you need to know. And let me, I'm going to come back to that. There's another page that I've just, if you'll bear with me, that I've got to read out of here. It's on page 27. He does a really nice job of kind of laying out the thesis early in the book. So you can get the idea quickly. What he does is compare our time to the Italian Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance was a time when the society at the time, coming out of the Dark Ages, sort of woke up and remembered the great art and the great music and so on. And especially they looked back to the Greeks and the Romans and so on. And some families, of course, funded then some artists to remember and recreate the greatness that had existed before. The Renaissance was primarily a moment in which people looked backwards in time and tried to recreate what used to be in terms of art. And they did it quite successfully. And it wasn't until that we moved from the Renaissance really into the exploration of the New World that we began to look forward instead of backward. But we often think of the Renaissance as a flowering of artistic expression, right? And it is true that it was. But what we don't remember, of course, is that the Renaissance was a flowering of expression for a few people. Whereas the vast majority of people were stuck toiling day by day just to get by. Byron Reese says the internet is our own Renaissance. So truly, I think we have entered an internet Renaissance that dwarfs anything the Medicis ever saw. I think it is bigger by, quote, 1,000 times, unquote, my favorite number used by Shakespeare. 1,000 times bigger than the original Renaissance. This is not to the 16th century Europeans' discredit or even to our credit. It simply has been enabled by technology combined with prosperity compounded over time. People have always had the drive and ability to build, create, discover, and explore. We have a natural desire to make beautiful things and a bone-deep need to understand the world we live in and our place in it. But before technology and prosperity, virtually everyone spent long, hard days scraping together enough calories for themselves and their family to survive. A very, very few people, however, were freed from this sustenance lifestyle, either by their fortuitous birth or by outstanding ability. Now, 1 billion or more can achieve that dream, and I foresee a time not far off when everyone on the planet can. Today, there are modern-day Da Vincis living in the world, in parts of the world, where just surviving is a full-time occupation, powerless to develop the gifts they could offer to the wider world. But all that is about to change. And he goes on to say, well, isn't the internet just full of junk? And he says, well, yes, of course, the internet is just full of junk. How many of you own a piece of antique furniture? How do you know that it's an antique piece of furniture? Because it's the one thing that survived from 150 years ago. 150 years ago, almost everything piece of furniture that was made was a piece of junk, except for that one piece that survived for 150 years. He said, how do we know what's going to survive that's on the internet today 150 years from now? We just know that certain things will, and they'll be called great works of art. We don't recognize them yet, but we know that they're there, and we know that they're probably there in much greater number than anything has ever existed before, because you've got 1 billion people creating them and not just a few. You begin to see the difference. To me, it kind of boggles the mind. So, what will that lead us to? How can he say that it will be the end of ignorance or the end of disease? It will lead to more and more people participating in more and more discovery in ways that are outside the systems that we have gotten used to over all these years, the last 100 years or so. How many of you know the story of Jack and Draka? If you don't, you got to know this story. This is a 16-year-old high school kid who last year was sitting in his high school biology class. The biology teacher is giving a lecture on antibodies, enzymes, genetics, and so on, but particularly on antibodies. Meanwhile, Jack Andraka is, against school rules, surfing the web, sitting at his desk. And while he's listening to the lecture on antibodies, he's reading an article about carbon nanotubes and their ability to conduct electricity under certain conditions. He has 2 family members who have died of pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is one of the most deadliest forms of cancer because it's so hard to discover. Your pancreas is so deep in your body, your doctor giving a physical exam cannot feel it, and therefore can't tell when there's a lump or something on the pancreas. And so pancreatic cancer tends to be discovered very late in its growth, and therefore too late to do anything about it. And in fact, I've known people who are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the person I knew in particular was gone in 3 months, which is not unusual. But it turns out when you have pancreatic cancer, it secretes into your blood a material called mesothelin. But it's in such minute amounts that it's not really discoverable, again, until the pancreatic cancer is too far advanced. Well, Jack Andraka, sitting in his high school biology class, age 16, hearing about antibodies and reading about carbon nanotubes, thought, I wonder if you could put those 2 things together and make a discovery tool for discovering mesothelin earlier in the life cycle of pancreatic cancer. He wrote up a little proposal. He sent it out to 200 research labs at universities around the country. 199 of them ignored him. But one researcher at Johns Hopkins answered his letter. And together they've created a test using, you take basically a sheet of paper-like stuff, you coat it with carbon nanotubes to which have been attached antibodies which will identify mesothelin. And then the carbon nanotubes will conduct electricity in a certain kind of way. And then you expose it to blood that has the mesothelin in it. And because the mesothelin will attach itself to the antibodies, or vice versa, it pushes the carbon nanotubes slightly apart, which changes the electrical conductivity profile of that sheet, which tells the person looking at it there's mesothelin in this blood, even though by other means I can't detect it. This test is 168 times faster, 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than the current standard. It costs 3 cents per test and takes 5 minutes. The test could also potentially be used to diagnose ovarian and lung cancer, both of which also produce abnormal levels of mesothelin. How does a 16-year-old kid do that? It's because of the internet. And what, again, Byron Reese says in here, we're going to start seeing discoveries like these just cascading all around us as more and more people have more and more ability to conduct experiments basically on the internet, as more and more data becomes available, as more and more information gets integrated, as you can contact more people, et cetera, and on and on and on the story goes. It's a big change. And it's going to happen very fast, I think, faster than we in the room imagine. And by the way, he says it's going to make it, nations and people in nations so wealthy that we don't need to worry about poverty anymore. So it might be a race. We might be in a race between those kinds of developments and the developments that I talked about when I talked about demographics. So my favorite futurist ever was a guy named Ed Lindemann, and he was the president of Whitworth College, now Whitworth University, in the 1970s. And Ed Lindemann used to say, if you don't go far enough back in memory or far enough ahead in hope, your present will be impoverished. It's interesting to go back 100 years to the year 1913. My father was just a couple years old then. 10 years later, he was known as the best big team driver in the Columbus, Montana area. His family was a dryland wheat farming family, having immigrated from Holland. His parents, had immigrated from Holland in 1908. And they lived in an era of astonishing change, because in their lifetimes, from the time they arrived in the U.S. in 1908 until they gave up on wheat farming in Montana in the mid-1920s and headed for Pendleton, knowing the wheat farming would be better, but experiencing the breakdown of the truck in Nampa, Idaho, and never getting out of Nampa, and thus I was born in Nampa some years later. They lived through the invention of the movie camera, the discovery of x-rays, the discovery of the cause of malaria, the invention of the airplane, the invention of the automobile, the invention of the assembly line, the final industrial revolution, the Russian Revolution, World War I, Albert Einstein proving that E equals mc squared, the conceiving of the whole atomic age. The telephone, although it existed before they were born, became a common communication tool, and on and on and on. It went all in about a 30-year time span. Now, it's true that Byron Reese says, and he's probably right, at least in internet language, that change is accelerating. But in terms of some big societal changes and big technology changes, there was a lot of change going on then. People were trying to figure out how to adjust to that change. One of them, most famously, was Henry Ford. And if you think of this as the road to the future at that time, one of the things that Henry Ford saw was roads. One of the things he saw was cars. And of course, what he really saw was lots of cars on lots of roads and an ability to sell lots of those cars. But he knew that he had to do a certain thing if that vision was going to come true. Henry Ford was a great one for writing down his thoughts. You can find just books of quotes by Henry Ford. This is a really amazing quote from Henry Ford. There is one rule for the industrialist, and that is make the best quality of goods possible at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. Last September, I had the privilege of speaking to the presidents of the 50 state chambers of commerce, and when they gathered for their annual meeting last September, it was in Coeur d'Alene. So I put this quote up to the heads of the state chambers of commerce from across the country, and I said, so when did we forget the third clause? And is there anything that we can do to remember it? And they will say, well, yeah. Well, and actually, they really appreciate it. And they said, you're absolutely right. We've got to figure that out. What is going on in the economy? Now we're going back from the light to the dark. Where's our pessimist in the room? You're going to have a lot of fun. Okay, you ready? In 1970, if you were a male high school graduate in America, how likely is it that you had a job? In 1970, how likely is it that you had a job? 50% had a job with a high school degree in 1970. 75% had a job. 85% had a job. 95% had a job. The answer is 95% had a job in 1970 with a high school degree. A lot of them probably right here at Boeing, right? Next one. In 1970, if you were a male high school graduate in America, how likely, in 2010 dollars, these are numbers regularized for 2010, what was your annual wages? In 1970, high school graduate, regularized for 2010 dollars, what were your annual wages? $25,000? $50,000? $35,000? I guess I skipped one. $35,000 or $75,000? The answer is $50,000. That was the average wage. That's why a Boeing worker in 1970 with a high school degree could afford a home right here in Snohomish or Island County, probably a vacation cabin up at a lake, maybe a motor home, and do all of that on one salary, on one income for the family at home with a high school degree. That was life in 1970. It wasn't a bad time in history. Now let's go forward. In 2010, if you're a high school male graduate in the US, what are the chances that you had a job? 50% have a job in 2010. Remember, this is sort of just at the end of the Great Recession. We're beginning to come out of it, but 50%, 75% had a job, 85% had a job, 95% had a job. Answer is you had a 75% chance of having a job. So you had 25% unemployment among male high school grads in 2010. More interestingly, what were your wages in 2010 dollars? $25,000? $50,000? $75,000? $35,000? Skipped one again. The answer is $25,000. The odds of having a job as a high school graduate had gone from 95% down to 75%, remembering it is during the Great Recession. And the average wage, more importantly, had gone from $50,000 in real terms to $25,000. How did that happen? And is that sustainable? If that doesn't change, can you have a free enterprise economy in a democratic society if that doesn't change? That's a really interesting question. I think it's a really deep question for us right now. This is the scariest chart ever from which that little survey was taken. There you see the odds of having a job in red and the salary from 1970 down to 2010. It's been a steady trend down. There's lots of reasons, and we'll get into the reasons in just a minute, but it's not the only thing. That chart is the reason that the Congressional Budget Office published this very famous chart a couple of years ago that showed that most of the income gains in the country are going to the top 10%, 1%, 0.1 of 1% and so on, while everybody else stays relatively flat or even declines a little bit from 1979 until the time when this chart was done. Is that sustainable? Can you have a national economy if that's the way the world works? It's an arguable point. I would argue one position. Some of you might argue a different. But that's the chart which that's the chart which really motivated Occupy Wall Street and all of that. But it's an interesting one. What drives it? Well, it's quite obvious what drives it. Technology makes it easier to do things without labor, makes labor more productive. Global commerce really took off after 1970. We got all this global labor competition, driving down wages, holding down wages, and it is true that companies are really struggle with that, no question about it. Public policy made a major shift after 1979, favoring the accumulation of income through non-wage earnings and disfavoring wage earnings with increases in Social Security taxes and so on. And then I think there was a significant value shift. And I think if we're really honest, it doesn't make us want to pat ourselves on the back. But this really occurred to me a year or two ago when I read a nice article in the New York Times in which they were interviewing some old-time CEOs from around Detroit, from the Midwest. So old-time CEOs who were CEOs back in 1970, when they earned a certain multiple of the guys on the factory floor. And they earned about 20 times what the guys on the factory floor earned. So they might earn $250,000 at that time when the factory floor guys were making their $50,000. Or they might even earn $500,000. But the gap wasn't that big. And now we all know the stories about the senior executive wages and so on. And some of us are actually probably quite happy to get them. What I remember is that the one CEO in particular said, I would be embarrassed to be paid that much. I couldn't show my face to the people in my company if I was being paid that much while they were being paid that little. I couldn't show my face. That's a real value shift. I blame it on the television show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I'm mostly kidding, but it was around that time that the television shows like that came on, and we began to worship great wealth in ways that kind of go beyond what we did historically since the founding of the country. And that value shift, I think, is really quite powerful. Everybody dreams now of getting rich. Very few people dream of building the local economy. We have to be in the local economy, we have to be in the national economy in order to get rich, but the dream is getting rich. It isn't building the community, not nearly to the degree as I think it was for earlier generations. I think there's something real going on there. The value shift, I think, is indicated or reflected is a better word in this economic chart that shows beginning in the mid-1970s, there was a split between productivity and wages. You can go back historically and productivity went up steadily and wages went up right along with it until the mid-1970s. And then productivity continued to go up, but wages started to go flat for the reasons that I've suggested. But what that chart says is the money is being made, but it's not going to wages. Where's it going? The money is being made, it's not going to wages. One of the reasons that it's not going to wages, given that we're in Snohomish County, it's kind of apropos, one of the birthplaces of American labor movement. There's also a very tight correlation between the decline of wages and the decline of private union membership in the United States. Now, you may or may not be a fan of unions. You may or may not have ever been a union member. And I certainly had a lot of quarrels with unions as a youth and thought they were quite evil institutions. But when I really look now at what's happening, as you know that we've gone from about 30% of the private labor workforce in the US being a union member down to 8%. There's a very tight correlation between not having an organization to argue for increased wages and this decline in wages. Now, whether or not if unions still existed at a 30% level, that would be different. I don't know, given the global competition and given technology and all the other changes that are very powerful drivers. But there's clearly a correlation. I showed this to the CEO and executives from the Home Depot last year. I don't think I'll ever be invited back. I'm serious. I'd done several pieces of work for them, and they invited me finally to come and do the CEO Executive Council. So I thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put this chart up, and I did. And I pretty much never heard from them again. But you just can't deny it. At some point, I think that we'll have to reinvent some kind of organizing tool for working people in order to negotiate to get around this issue. Because here's the question, if the trend line just continues going like that, who's going to buy Henry Ford's cars? Henry Ford, of course, whether this is myth or real, became famous, as we all know, for the $5 day. And his fellow industrialists, we are told, hated him for it. They said, what do you think you're doing? And he said, I'm paying my people $5 a day so they can buy these dang cars. They cost $240. They gotta pay them enough so they can buy them. That was his whole purpose, was to make sure that people made enough. That's why that third clause in his sentence said they could buy what was being made. I don't think that you can have a national economy. Now, maybe it's just two more generations and the global wage levels will all even out and we just have to sort of live through it for 2 more generations. But it's a significant issue. Okay, we got to move right along. We're going to run out of time here. Knowledge value economy. What we do know about the economy, despite all that stuff that I just shared with you about the performance of it, is that we live in an economy where your ability to get ahead depends on knowledge value. It's what a product or service or a person knows that really matters. And what that means is we need knowledge. And therefore, we need new and better ways to organize communities to enable learning for millions of people. This is where I think libraries have a role. But it's interesting, I don't think libraries have their historical role. I think that what libraries do in the next 15 years, by 15 years from now, will look significantly different than it looks today. But only if we put our heads together and ask, how can we use this kind of a resource to accomplish this kind of a thing in this future set of future realities that we're dealing with? Okay, the last trend area has to do with climate change, and I just don't want to ignore it because there's so much opportunity here. Is anybody here an elected official? I know if you're an elected official, you're not allowed to say words like climate change and global warming. So you'll just have to bear with me because I know in our politics we're never supposed to say this out loud. The Arctic is likely to be ice-free at the end of the summer. Remember, it melts every summer, it refreezes in the winter. And the amount of ice left at the end of every summer is on the decline. And it's leading scientists to speculate in which summer might it be essentially completely ice-free in September, which has lots and lots of implications. Which summer is it? 2020, 2030, 2040, what was my last choice? 2050. Best guess right now is about 2030. There's a lot of debate about this. And if you want to track this, you can track it for yourself online. Just go to the Snow and Ice Data Center. Snow and Ice Data Center. They put out a daily report now of how much ice is in the Arctic. It's trending lower than the average. Today, I checked it last night. Trending lower than the average, lower than last year, which was the least amount of ice ever since they've been measuring it, was left in the Arctic in September of 2012. And we're below that line now, in spite of the relatively cold spring that we had. Why does this matter? Because as the Arctic melts out, it's an indicator that global warming is occurring. I first heard an Army Corps of Engineers engineer who works on cold weather roads was the first one who informed me that the Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. And therefore, it acts as kind of a canary in the coal mine. It's kind of telling us where things are headed. And this was the map on the 16th of September of this year. The kind of pink line that you can kind of vaguely see around the white, that's the average amount of ice left in September, and the white is the amount of ice left this past September. About half as much ice as the average amount was left. And that leads scientists to kind of wonder whether they should speed up. The Canadian military projects that the Arctic could be ice-free as soon as 2020, depending on what happens, obviously, between now and then. Why is this important? Nobody really knows what the impact of this is going to be. But the hypothesized impact now is that it is already, because the Arctic ice pack has such an impact on the jet stream and on storm tracks, that it's already having an impact of leading to droughts that are longer. Basically what happens is that when a weather pattern sets in, it stays in the same place for a longer period of time than it has historically since weather services have been tracking this stuff. So they're hypothesizing that it could lead to longer, rainstorms that go on for a longer period of time and more floods. And then it could lead to a drought that goes on for a longer period of time, or a winter storm that dips down over the Midwest and stays there for 3 weeks instead of 3 days. And so you suddenly get this massive amount of snow, and of course everybody says, well, see, global warming isn't happening, but it's precisely because of global warming that you're getting all that snow. And then the next summer they have the longest heat wave that they've ever seen in human memory. And they're hypothesizing that is a likely, well, a possible outcome of the melting out of the Arctic. What does it mean? Well, it means we have to think in new ways. I'm going to skip this little video because it's going to take too long. It's because I want to finish and keep us on time, and I want to have at least 5 minutes for questions. So I started with this question. What is your image of the future? I said, if you're an optimist, I'll have some things for you, and if you're a pessimist, I'll have some things for you. It made me think as I was sitting here listening to John Lynn talk, I quickly pulled this up. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. And Charles Dickens continues. One of the reasons that Byron Reese in his book, Infinite Progress, says it's actually easier to know the future than we claim is that human beings stay very consistent through time. Technology changes, prosperity changes, external conditions change, but the people in the Renaissance or the founding fathers or my grandparents living 100 years ago were just as smart as we are. And while human nature, you can argue, changes a little bit, but very slowly over time, what he says is the choices that we make over and over and over again. And so therefore he thinks he can make some he thinks accurate assumptions about where we're headed. So what is your image of the future? I think the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. So the question for the library, the question for the region, the question for your company or your organization is always, so what is it that we want to do to create the future? What the world looks like in 2025 depends in part on what we do between now and then. What the world looks like in 2062, the Jetsons year, depends almost completely on what we do between now and then, rather than on things that have happened up till now. If you're going to begin to ask, what do we want to do in the future, it helps to ask some questions. What is probable? What should you get ready for? What is possible? What's outside the boundaries of the way you usually think about things? What's outside the boundaries of the way we've usually thought about libraries and their integration with all the other institutions of our region? And then finally, what is preferred? We called this program Cultivating the Edges of Risk and Opportunity, and I've clearly talked about risks and opportunities. I want to conclude the last slide with these challenges. I think it's a critical moment in history, not for the first time, but for our time. I think the preferred future challenges that I see are the following: developing the capacity to help people develop relevant skills in much larger numbers. Confronting the looming retirement crisis in the midst of income gap economics. That's a very hard job, but it's not impossible. In fact, it's actually even not all that mysterious, in my opinion, what we would do if we chose to fix that problem or those problems. Reigniting a business passion to build the American economy versus a passion merely to get rich. And then finally, stepping up to climate change now by seizing the sustainability opportunities that are all around us. They're sort of endless, the things that we could do to become more sustainable, and they're all good business anyway. So what is your image of the future? What future do you want? That's what we're going to talk about on the panel after we take a break, but I believe there are, according to my watch, about 6 minutes for questions, which means if I'm really short, I could probably answer 3 good questions. Thank you very much for having me here. So who has a question or a comment? If you want to say, I think you're off base on that one.
Have there been studies done as we become the data-driven, high-tech society that we're becoming, the effects of the loss of the art of conversation and the loss of interpersonal contact. In my office, we had a situation where if I have an employee that says, you know, I tried to find the answer on the internet, I tried, I can't find it, they know that now I'll tell them, pick up the telephone, call somebody. And we seem to have lost that along with that art of negotiation and interpersonal contact.
Yeah, I think there is I do think there's an issue there in terms of it is a different kind of communication that we engage in now. It is probably not accurate to say that we don't communicate as well. We certainly communicate differently. Another interesting study that Byron cites in here, which is self-evident as soon as you stop to think about it. Until a few years ago, the average person who graduated from high school in America or from college in America never wrote another word the rest of their lives. People are writing so many more words now, and so many more people are writing so many more words that if you take writing as a form of communication, we are vastly increasing the participation in communication. If you take sending text messages back and forth as a form of efficient communication, clearly we're communicating. I communicate, you know, I've traveled for 20 years as a consultant. I communicate with my wife far more now than I did pre-text era. We talk less on the phone, but I communicate with her several times a day now in ways that I just didn't before. So have we lost communication or have we gained communication? In that sense, the one exception I think is the ability to sit down face-to-face without technology and to carry on a face-to-face conversation or a face-to-face negotiation. And I think you can make a case that's being lost. Now, whether or not that ultimately is a detriment to human civilization, I don't know. How many of us sit around campfires sharing stories and are good at it? Not very many of us. But our ancestors in deep history were all really good at sitting around campfires and sharing stories. Are we better or worse at communicating than they are? I don't know. We certainly are different. So I think it's a little hard to make the case that it's certainly going to be worse. It's certainly going to be different. And on that one criteria, you know, in my professor days, which I was in my early life, my first career, I was a professor of communication. So I taught interpersonal communication and small group communication and public speaking and organizational communication, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, we did a lot of sitting around in small groups and dyads and triads and so on, as we used to call them, and doing communication exercises and practicing listening and getting up and practicing talking and so on. And so I have a high value for that. And if you're good at that, you're still at an advantage in the society. But that's a really good question. Ultimately, we'll find out what the answer is. Yes?
People wanting to just get rich and not paying their workers enough. What are some things the key things at least that you recommend to business owners, executives to do to help cause employees to take more ownership and to get away from just them getting rich and all the employees?
Well, there are a number of different things that can be done. Number one, you just have to decide to make less, pay more. That's what I do in my business. It's kind of painful, but you do it. You just say, okay, this person deserves a sort of living wage and benefits, even though I'm a tiny little business. The second thing that you do is, and there's increasing conversation about this. It hasn't gone much beyond the conversation level, but more and more, and it's not a brand new idea, but looking for more employee ownership models. And of course, there are many, many good ones in this country and in other countries. So in certain businesses and certain enterprises, that's a possibility. Until recently, I was saying the one thing we shouldn't do, you can take a look at the super wealthy in the country, and you don't have to earn that much actually to be in the top 10%. If you're making about $250,000, you're in the top 10%. And between 2009 and 2012, the American economy grew more wealth. The amount of wealth that the American economy grew, 147% of it went to the top 10%. You say, well, that's not possible because only 100% of the increased wealth could go somewhere. No, 147% went to the top 10%, which means that the bottom 90% actually had a decline. In 1983, the famous bottom 47%, 1983, the bottom 40% had an average net worth of $15,000. In 2009, the bottom 47% had an average negative net worth. They had more debt than assets. Those are all really big changes, and it's just something that can't go on forever. Whatever can't go on forever probably won't. And so, you can end up with some very non-positive scenarios unless you really take seriously fixing this. So until a couple years ago, or even until last year, I was saying, let's not worry about the people at the top. Just leave them alone. More power to them. Wish I was there. If I win the lottery, I'll join them. But let's concentrate on what would you do about wages and about the taxing system and about benefits and so on. And one of the things you might do is study the Eisenhower years, which is the years when the biggest build out of the middle class happened. What were all the public policies that were in place back in those years, from tax to labor law to everything else? That's an interesting one. But more recently, I don't think you can actually solve the problem at the bottom unless you also look at the top. And that means changing some tax laws and changing how certain trading is practiced and so on. It is not impossible to do. It is politically, socially very, very difficult problem to tackle. But how can we have a U.S. economy unless we tackle that? It's just it cannot work. I don't think. So.
Floated structure through the 70s and 80s where divorces really skyrocketed. And now families are kind of left with the burden of really caring for elderly, taking care of young, carrying health care insurance for 26-year-olds. And that, there's this incredible implosion on top of families that are kind of standing on quicksand.
That's worth calling out, and thank you for doing that. It's all part of that of the bigger picture. However, I mean, one of the ways that we coped with that 1970 to 2010 wage curve. How did we cope with that? Well, the first thing we did was to go to two-income families where we could, and then we went to credit card debt, and then we went to home equity, and then we ran out of options. And that's sort of how we got into the crash that we fell into. But the family one, that's just a reality. That's another part of the puzzle that we have to deal with. And unless you can provide an economy that enables individual people to make enough to support themselves and a potential family member or two, it's very hard to figure out how to get out of that. I will tell you where Brian Reese, this guy says we're going. I don't know that I agree with this. He says, look, the internet is going to generate so much wealth, but so few jobs, that the only thing that's going to work in the more distant future is a guaranteed national income. You just do what they do in Alaska. You live in Alaska, you get $12,000 a year because Alaska has oil. Boom, here's your check. You live in America, we generate all this wealth from the internet, here's your check. I don't know if I like that society, but that he says that's the only solution. I don't know if that's it, but I think the bottom line is, I think isn't it that I don't know who in the room is a professional economist. It's almost like we need a new economic theory of how to do a society in this global world, this internet world, this family split up world, and all that stuff. And all the traditional models are really struggling.
Each time you use an example of a high school male, would the trend look exactly the same for a high school female?
The trend would look similar for a high school female. They studied males. As a matter of fact, in that particular study, they actually controlled out Hispanic males because they were not relevant enough in the early 1970s. And then at the end of the time period, because so many had very, very low wages, it would have skewed it too much. So it was actually a study just of African American and white males in the U.S. Yeah, it's similar for women, except as we know, you earn about 80, 75, 78% on the dollar, so it's actually the numbers are lower. It's also similar for colleges. I was just in Denver this week speaking to the Association for College and University Planning. And if you do it for college degrees, basically there's about a 40% premium. If you get a college degree, you earn about 40% more than a high school graduate. So you just take the same curve, you make it 40% higher, but then the trend, the line, is still very similar. It doesn't fall quite as fast. It goes a little bit flatter for a college graduate. But just having everybody graduate from college, although I think that actually is a pretty good thing, doesn't fix that problem. And that's unfortunately, most of the conversation that you hear in the country today is, well, our problem is we don't have enough people with college degrees. If we could get everybody a college degree, then everybody will make enough money. But the economic system isn't designed to do that. And it's part of the answer, but it's not the answer. It's time for our morning break if we're going to stay on time. Thank you very much. I said I would scare you a little and hopefully inspire you a little. Hopefully that worked. There's good and there's bad. Here we go. We'll have a panel after a 10-minute break.